The Catholic charity story continues, and there's a common theme through things that have happened in the last 24 hours. And that's people broadly are tired of not just Catholic charities, but religious non governmental organizations taking contracts from the government and using the taxpayer money to subvert the country. And it's to the point now where I wonder what kind of price is the Catholic Church going to be paying for this? As a Catholic, I have to ask that question. What price? Because of the subversion done by the bishops. Will the church in America pay for this? Think about that as we go over our stories today. But first, I want to implore you, if you hadn't heard the news, former SSPX Bishop Richard Williamson has passed away at the age of 84. For a couple of days, people kept saying he had passed away, but he was in his final days, in his final moments. And I was following a trustworthy account on X who covered this, and he finally did pass away. And yes, LifeSite has confirmed it. So pray for the repose of his soul, if you would, please. He was one of the 4 who was consecrated a bishop illicitly, we'll say, with quotes. The church was obviously in a state of emergency in the 80s like it is today. So the church provides the authority to do the consecrations that were done. He was one who was excommunicated. Later it was lifted, but then he was excommunicated again for, they say the same thing, but that doesn't work because he did consecrate bishops by himself later after he left the SSPX. But again, that as excommunication, that doesn't work. But also in the site, one of the things cited was he delicate topic, we'll say, but there's an official story about the most horrible event in human history that from World War II. And he denied the scope and scale of it. He denied the official story. He got some nasty labels attached to him for that. He had an opinion that most people would consider wrong on that, and that's listed as one of the reasons he was excommunicated, which is most curious because having a bad opinion about something, no matter how bad that opinion is, isn't usually grounds for excommunication. So again, this is another one of those post-conciliar, we excommunicate people for political reasons kind of stories. And he passed away. Pray for the repose of his soul, that he had and that he received the grace of final perseverance. And he's a figure that a lot of people don't like a lot because he would say things that would really ruffle feathers. Anytime I bring up Bishop Williamson, and without fail, there are women in the comments who respond about how he was like a blunt force on traditional relationships and traditional, family things that a lot of people, the way he said things bothered people. So, but please pray for the repose of his soul in your great charity, especially if you don't like him. Consider it a moment to tax and the limits of your charity and to follow our Lord's great and most uncomfortable of all commands, to pray for our enemies. If you find him to be a reprehensible figure, you should especially pray for the repose of his soul. That all having been said, ongoing story. I got an angry email yesterday from somebody. The government didn't cut off Catholic charities. Blah, 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 blah. Read the executive order. I did read the executive order. And just a few minutes before reading that email that I got from somebody, I had watched the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security actually bragging about this, that what they had done here.
Yes, well, thank you, Will, for inviting me to be with you. Today, we are announcing that we have stopped all grant funding that's being abused by NGOs to facilitate illegal immigration into this country. So it's amazing to me the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent by the federal government that has been sent to NGOs to facilitate this invasion of our country.
So I mean, enough said there, right? I mean, it happened. I don't know why some people are denying that the reality of what we're talking about here, but it very much did happen. So that having been said, this story is taking off and picking up a life of its own. And it looks all like it got kicked off by a normal citizen just digging through tax records, putting them into a single usable spreadsheet. And so I'll show you here. This is just a normal person on an anonymous account on X. He said, when I started posting on nonprofits reporting government funding, I was given a tip by a credible entity. He doesn't say who it was, but that means somebody probably in the investigative industry or in the government themselves, that they needed the actual award IDs to cancel the funding. So Grants always have an award ID number. It's a way for the government to use its databases to quickly track down an award in question. It says, that is what motivated me to dissect the U.S. spending database and put the awards up in an easily searchable format along with award ID and agency. That got released late Monday night, and now here we are. Right? I mean, there's Charlie Kirk talking about how they've stopped funding all grants to NGOs facilitating the ongoing problem. So that's how it started. I'm going to show you how it's going because more information has come out and it actually gets way worse. So this is just another normal person, right? You know, just another normal person posting this information that they found. They say the Catholic Charities Houston received more than $500 million of taxpayer funds. Now, remember what we talked about. Going back to 2009, it was $5.2 billion going towards the U.S. bishops. That includes their cut of the money that came from this. So we don't be sure exactly how much money went to the USCCB by itself, how much went to Catholic Charities. When you start counting all the various Catholic Charities organizations, when you start breaking it down, the money is staggering. They say this money predominantly went to those in question for cars, rent, housing, food, attorneys, cash assistance. $81 million in government grants to Catholic Charities Houston alone in 2023. And I believe that's the woman from the video that we'll talk about here in a moment. I showed it to you yesterday. The woman was helping people to break the law, which has got to be a violation of the conditions of their grant award. But here, take a look at this. This is something she posted a year ago with how does the revenue for the NGO, Catholic Charities, nearly quadruple since the Biden administration took over. So take a look at this. For fiscal year 2018, so this would have been in the tax form that they published by April of 2019. They received, you can't really see it here. I'll have links to it in today's show notes at returntotradition.org, minutes after this live stream is over. But you can't really see it here, but the number is 42,419,000 and change. All right, that's 2018's tax year. 2021's tax year, $217,705,000 just to Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Galveston, Houston. How does it quadruple in just 3 years? Nobody really knows the answer to that question. And actually, I closed that out prematurely because it doesn't get any better. If you want to see what they're using this money for, well, here it is. You scroll down here, and what you're seeing, let's see if we can get this a little bit bigger. Mute that. But this is the job listings, right, for them. And you'll start seeing here the jobs for most of these have to do with the program in question the government shut down. They are spending gigantic amounts of dollars on human resources to facilitate this, including legal advice on how to get around the system. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what your tax dollars on this question have been going for. And people have every right to be upset about this. Every right to be upset. And the bishops don't seem to understand this, which is why I found this story most perplexing when it broke yesterday. Go to Catholic News Agency for this headline. Cardinal Dolan, Vance's remarks on bishops and the movement of people, scurrilous, very nasty. Maybe Cardinal Dolan was feeling pressure from certain quarters after the Al Smith dinner in the fall, and then after saying the invocation at the inauguration. But he's all fire and brimstone here. The bishops have a narrative. And the narrative that the U.S. bishops are pushing is without question that the Bible commands us to do these things. And I'm going to have one of their own brother bishops correct them on this. I tracked down an old interview from Cardinal Robert Sarah where he talks about how this whole topic is diabolical. Anybody who uses the Bible for it, who uses our Lord to justify this, is doing the work of the devil. Let's see. This is what Cardinal Dolan had to say from the article, quote, Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York strongly criticized comments Vice President J.D. Vance made on Sunday questioning the motives of U.S. Catholic bishops and their efforts to serve the unwelcome visitors and resettle the people in question, in which Vance suggested financial incentives were their driving force rather than compassion. Vance, a Catholic who took office last week, was asked January 26th about the bishop's criticism of the Trump administration's various new directives on the subject in question, specifically the government's rescinding of a policy that previously restricted the arrest of those in question at sensitive locations such as churches. I think that the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops needs to actually look in the mirror a little bit and recognize that when they receive over $100 million, it was lowballing that number significantly, to help move to find places for the unwelcome visitors. Are they worried about humanitarian concerns, or are they actually worried about their bottom line? Vance replied. Asked if he believed the U.S. bishops are actively hiding criminals from law enforcement, Vance argued that the USCCB has not been a good partner in common sense enforcement of the question at hand that the American people voted for, and I hope, again, as a devout Catholic, that they'll do better. I could swear he said practicing Catholic in that interview, but everybody keeps quoting him as saying devout, and I don't know why. Dolan on Tuesday expressed frustration over Vance's implication that the bishop's stance on the question was merely a financial calculation, calling the comments scurrilous and very nasty. I was really disappointed with what he said on Face the Nation the other day, and I don't mind telling you, somewhat hurt. He hurt his fifis. This was not only harmful, this was inaccurate. You heard what he said. Oh, the bishops, they are in favor of this problem because of the bottom line, because they're making money off of it. That's scurrilous. It's very nasty, and it's not true, Dolan said, speaking on his weekly Sirius XM show, Conversations with Cardinal Dolan. Dolan said the church's involvement on the question is frequently at the behest of secular leaders such as mayors and governors, who he said recognizes the church's ability to manage resources efficiently and transparently. You want to come look at our audits, which are scrupulously done. You think we make money caring for these people? We're losing it hand over fist. We're not in a money-making business, he continued. Again, many of us don't believe them. Some political leaders and commentators have accused the U.S. bishops of complying with or facilitating the problem through their programs, a charge the bishops have strongly denied. And he goes on and on to talk about what the bishops have said. And I will tell you, strictly speaking, could it be true that the bishops don't make money? Yes, it could be strictly speaking true that the bishops don't make money on this. The NGOs, on the other hand, the nonprofits, and remember, most of them are mission-driven by ideology, and they will wear religion like a skin suit to achieve their ideological goals. That goes almost without question. Now, Dolan isn't the only one who chimed in on this. On the other side, on the more sensible side, if you're not familiar with Dr. Anthony Esolen, he's a Catholic scholar. He has one of the finest translations of the Dante's Divine Comedy you will ever find into more contemporary English, and it's an accurate translation. So if you've ever tried to read the Inferno or the Purgatory or the Paradise in the language that's usually translated into doesn't really work for you, try Dr. Anthony Esolen's translation. It's one of the best. Here's what he had to say. He said, "Dear Catholic Charities, I'm not your enemy, but please get that video that I mentioned at the beginning showing the people in question how to game the system off your page. The look is terrible. It's one thing to help people in need. It's another to help lawbreakers use the law to evade the law, when the law they have broken is just. That is how it will seem to ordinary people." End quote. Dr. Esolen gets it. That is at the core of this. And this is why I opened with this question. How much damage are the bishops and the NGOs doing to the Catholic Church and her credibility on this question? This is something that people need to be asking themselves. I have seen in the comment section on a lot of these things, backlash directed at the church as the mystical body of Christ. It brings like the worst elements of Protestants and atheists out of the woodwork. You ever notice that a lot of times atheists and Protestants use the same arguments against the Catholic Church? Think about the reasoning for that. But they do it. And they have fueled through their actions at the NGOs and their rhetoric, like what you heard from Dolan, they are fueling a backlash against the Catholic Church. And this is one of the things that they don't realize what they're doing. They are unanimous in defending this practice, claiming they lose money hand over fist. Though frankly, again, most of us don't believe them. And part of the reason is, as I said yesterday, we don't believe them because 20 years ago, most of these same bishops were somewhere in the authority pipeline helping sweep away the Ted McCarrick problem, especially guys like Dolan who were cardinals back then. We don't believe them because a lot of them don't have credibility. It doesn't help that they cite the Bible, claiming it's a work of mercy and that the government is in the wrong, meaning government now is in the wrong. You know who doesn't actually agree with like Cardinal Dolan on this? Or the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops? This is a piece from 5 years ago now, published in the Church Life Journal. It's a synopsis of something Cardinal Sarah has said on this, with the headline, Cardinal Sarah's Warning to the West. This references a number of his interviews, but one of the interviews it really references was done in 2019. He was talking about the problem in Europe. You might remember 10 years ago, it was such a hot button issue in Europe that like our hosts started cracking down on mentioning the subject at all. I remember finding that one out the hard way. So I'm kind of careful how I talk about it. And even then, you had bishops in Europe and in North America saying the Catholic Church had a biblical duty to support the things going on there at the time. Cardinal Sarah had some really choice words because Americans hit the breaking point on this. So this is from the article. Quote, while the African prelate sometimes sounds not unlike a vocal America First Catholic, a thoughtful reading of his statements makes clear that these are incidental similarities, not ideological concurrences, which, as I will say to interrupt, is a good thing. The Catholic Church should not be ideological. It shouldn't be. It should be dedicated to the truth of Christ and not to political concerns. That when it comes time, when politics inevitably comes up as a moral question, the church will sometimes look like it sides with one side or another. Cardinal Sarah is in the right here because I've read what the church teaches on this. It's very simple, and he's about to reiterate it for you. Take, for example, Cardinal Sarah's stance on the problem in Europe from 10 years ago. In an interview with the French magazine Valeurs Actuelles, which I will post a link to their interview, it is behind a paywall, but I'll have a link to what they're referencing here on my show notes. It's already posted there, but it hasn't been published yet. Cardinal Robert Sarah, appeared to contradict Pope Francis's position on the movement of people, saying it is better to help people flourish in their culture than to encourage them to come to a Europe in full decadence. It is a false exegesis to use the word of God to promote the problem at hand. His reasoning, however, is not that the people in question pollute or corrupt the cultures they enter. Instead, in the day is now far spent, he notes that Europe displays oligarchic tendencies. Sound familiar? It takes in the groups in question with false promises, only to stick them in camps, stealing away their God-given rights. In Europe, the people in question are deprived of their dignity. Same with America. In fact, in America, this is mostly framed as an economic question, and they are exploited for economic reasons, as well as political reasons. There is a political benefit to bringing in a whole crop of new people who you can be sure will support you in political contests going forward. Human beings are parked in these groups and condemned to wait without anything to do with their days. In France, the specific place there was a disgrace. How is a man without a job supposed to find genuine fulfillment? The cultural religious uprooting of the people in question thrown into Western countries that are themselves going through an unprecedented crisis is a lethal compost. The Cardinal does not lay the blame for their movement at the feet of the people moving, but instead roundly criticizes European countries and worldwide corporations for this debasement. Entire nations have been ravaged economically by the unscrupulous multinationals that pillage national economies. Neo-colonial practices that infantilize governments are a disgrace. Is it any surprise then when populations flee such situations in streams? They conceal the truth, and they dare to wonder whether it is necessary to welcome the populations that arrive on European shores. Now, I'm not even talking about the organized offenders like practices of those who exploit their poverty. He goes further, criticizing the West and Europe in particular for their hollow humanism. Countries and NGOs, he says, organize humanitarian conferences by day and then sell implements of war at night. Diplomats and decision makers put contracts for these implements and resource extraction before the lives of thousands of the youngest in Yemen. Relaying a heartbreaking story about some of his countrymen who passed in ships' refrigeration units en route to Europe, he decries the passing of countless impoverished Africans. And it goes on and on and on. You could just change the names of places to Central and South America, and it's the exact same thing. They pay lip service to the plight of the people and then instrumentalize them, use them as a tool to smash down their political adversaries. That's the whole point. It's exploitation built upon exploitation. Everybody pays for this, except for those who benefit, which is a small cadre of people. And yet, the bishops are willing to play along with this. And if they really are losing money hand over fist, why are they willing to play along? Because they cannot possibly be blind and deaf to the things that Cardinal Robert Sarah has been saying on this for a decade. He's been one of the most outspoken critics of this. And yet, they keep doing it. Why? Do they think they're going to get peace at the table? You're going to see a rising tide of anti-Catholic sentiment based on this. You will absolutely see that. Jean Max says he never said these things. Yeah, he did. Cardinal Sarah said these things, and it's right there in a public interview. It's quoted. It's in the books he wrote. He definitely said those things. Margaret says it would be a blessing if Cardinal Sarah had more clout. Yeah, he will be 80 soon, so the chance of becoming Pope dropped to 0 here in the next few months. Wasn't Catholic Charities caught distributing artificial barriers to being fruitful and multiplying a few years ago? Yes, they were. Cardinal Sarah is one of the better voices on these things, because you'll notice in his statement there, it didn't line up neatly with any ideology. He said things that you would think sounded like when Francis talks about this stuff. He also said things that sound like when more nationalistic or patriotic Americans and Europeans talk about this stuff, because there is truth on both sides of this that doesn't allow for the practice that's going on. That's why it's not a neatly ideological topic in general, but it has become one. And it's so weird to see the U.S. bishops on the wrong side of this. Can America afford totalitarianism? We are nowhere near that. We are nowhere near that happening. That's not happening in America. It's just not. But his is not the only response. This was sent to me. I think this is a good post from the Substack of called Popehead. If you're not familiar with the Popehead Substack, you should go check it out. They have a document, Cum Nimbus Absurdum, against the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. This is a takedown of this whole topic. And he posits the idea, something that will never happen. You are probably never going to get a pope from the United States who, while the United States is the world's primary political power, you're probably not going to see that happen. But he posits the idea of what would happen if you got a pope from the United States who corrected the record on this issue. And here's what he has to say. He says, if the keys of St. Peter were currently in the possession of any of the historical pontiffs preceding the turn of the 20th century, a declaration may have been issued resembling the one above. Here's the one above. It is absurd and utterly inconvenient that the people in question, who through their own free will have consciously chosen to transgress the laws of the nation they entered, can, under the pretext that pious American Christians must accept them and sustain their habitation, are so utterly ungrateful to their host that instead of thanks for gracious treatment, they boldly claim moral superiority. It is absurd and utterly insulting that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, rather than condemn the mass of those entering, has chosen to profit off this felonious swindle while simultaneously rebuking the nation's head of state for upholding the laws of the land. And I could see a preconciliar pope saying that. Leo XIII would be a little nicer in his language than that, but I could see like a Pius X saying that easily. A declaration written in sober and biting Latin, full of rhythmic and winding sentences, building momentum with each line and invective, culminating in a fiery rebuke of Timothy Broglio and the obscene circus masquerading as a bishop's conference. Alas, we are not so fortunate. 1 week ago, Archbishop Timothy P. Broglio, president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, offered the following statement in response to the recent executive orders of the Trump administration. And it goes on to talk about, just quotes at length, how it's bad and unchristian and a violation of the gospel to do all this stuff, which is not true. Following the ancient tradition, Pope Francis has declared 2025 as a Jubilee year of hope. As Christians, our hope is always in Jesus Christ, who guides us through storm and calm weather. He is the source of all truth. Our prayer is one of hope that as a nation blessed with many gifts, our actions demonstrate a genuine care for our most vulnerable sisters and brothers, including the unborn, the poor, the elderly, infirm, and those who are coming over. The just judge expects nothing less. See how they're doing it. Remember what Cardinal Sarah talked about, how it is a diabolical use of scripture to justify what you're seeing happening right now. And this problem has been going on for years, using scripture. Rather than engage in methodical rebuttal of the absurd statement, I will instead offer an equally absurd response, a history lesson. Trump, Vance, I pose this question to you. What is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops? Where does it find its authority? At the heart of this question lies one of the most dramatic semantic inversions in the history of the church. Fun fact, national bishops' conferences have no authority. They're informal organizations. They might be recognized legally by the secular system, but they're an invention of the post-conciliar era. They were never even really formally recognized until the Synod on Synodality, to give you an idea. the American church hierarchy formally came into being on November 16th, 1789. Pope Pius VI had created the primacy of Baltimore and shortly after consecrated the American Jesuit John Carroll as the bishop-elect of the aforementioned see on August 15th, 1790. Carroll was granted full centralized power over all church properties, parishes, clergy, and territory within the United States. John had the distinction of being part of the Carroll family, one of the wealthiest of the first families and the largest landowners in Maryland. They were a family deeply committed to the ideals of the American Revolution and served the mechanisms of the movement with pride. Both John's older brother and his cousin played undeniable parts in the nation's birth. Charles Carroll was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration of Independence, and Daniel Carroll was at the forefront of revolutionary stonecutter intrigues. John was raised in a cultural environment that lived and breathed American republicanism. In 1788, the Baltimore priests had asked Pope Pius VI for a special dispensation to choose their own bishop, as to be as free as possible from suspicion and odium to their countrymen. This request was granted. John Carroll was chosen as he was the most ideologically aligned with the American founding fathers, as well as a personal friend of men such as Washington and Franklin. Bishop John Carroll had a uniquely American vision for the church, one that encouraged assimilation into the dominant Anglo-American cultural milieu, and one that maintained a level of independence from Rome. And it goes on. Let it be known, this article is not one of Catholic polemics. It is not hostile to Protestantism. I am writing this today for a general American audience so they can arrive at a clear picture of which institution is attempting to browbeat them over the removal of unwelcome guests. I am sympathetic to many Carroll's directives to facilitate integration and wider American cultural cohesion, but I bring this up to juxtapose how radically different the Americanism of the early American Catholic hierarchy was compared to the supposed Americanism that Pope Francis decries today. Now, Catholic traditionalists may certainly object to Carroll and his project, as 18th and 19th century Americanism was practically synonymous with modernism and liberal thought. And yet, an American patriot cannot in good conscience share in these objections. For whatever faults Carroll possessed, the impulse behind his contention with Rome was a product of patriotic fervor and devotion. And anything resembling the liberalism of Carroll's milieu would be decried as a hammer handed to a liberal today. They were called Carroll was the source of the Americanists, and Americanism was rejected in the late 19th century by the church as an error. But it has developed into something different than it was a century before. What you have to understand here is there was, in the history of the church in America, a hard time with Catholics assimilating. It's always been the case. Go look at the way the Irish and the Italians had a hard time assimilating. And then you had parts of Mexico, large parts, like a third of the Mexican Empire, annexed by the United States. Suddenly had a very large Catholic population here. And that population always had a hard time fitting in. Always. And so what did the Catholics do in the United States? They turned to practically tripping over themselves to prove how patriotic they were, until it came into our consciousness and we got assimilated, for better or worse. That was how this all really began in the United States, to the point now where our bishops trip over themselves to be accepted by the hierarchy. Go back again to the first times you saw priests in the United States not wearing cassocks. It was around the time of the writing of the Baltimore Catechism. This is another fun fact of history, folks. A lot of people don't seem to realize this. The Baltimore Catechism, something American traditionalists love, but the time it was published, was looked at with a raised eyebrow a little bit compared to other catechisms. It was considered a little liberal compared to others. The same people who put that together were the ones who got a lot of American priests to stop wearing cassocks and to start putting on the clerics that you might recognize more, were the black jacket and the slacks. Yes, they wore the black shirt with the collar, but that's where a lot of that came from. It was a desire to assimilate. And what ends up happening with your hierarchy, when assimilation, acceptance by the broader culture, becomes baked into the cake of the hierarchy in America, you get the bishops tripping over themselves to be accepted by the authorities. You get our nonprofits taking on these contracts and just siding with whatever they think the cultural zeitgeist is. Now, the problem is that the culture shifted so sharply and dramatically in the last couple of years that the bishops are now on the outside looking in, and they're in an unholy marriage with the state. They can't give up the funds they get. It's not possible for them. It would be catastrophic for them. I showed you what Houston was doing. in Houston, the Archdiocese of Houston, the Catholic Charities operation there went from $42 million in grant funds for this specific kind of program to something like $270 million for this specific kind of grant program. How do you grow? How does it grow that quickly in 3 years? Nobody offers a good explanation for that, except that the hierarchy in America does the bidding of the state until they refuse, which is now where they are. Again, started with Kristi Noem bragging that they got rid of these programs. Remember yesterday, I showed you there were meetings going on with heads of NGOs talking about how they were coming up with emergency 30, 60, 90-day programs, and most won't make it to 30 days because all of their funding comes from the state. All of it. Catholic Charities will be one that fares a little differently because of those second collections. But if something doesn't change for them, you're going to see Catholic Charities probably collapse. Traditionalist Catholic says the American bishops sold us out for their 30 pieces under Biden. Right, and you notice how the bishops remained silent when the stonecutters bragged that he joined them the day before he left office? That story went away. Bishops never said a thing about it. You'd think they would. He was the highest profile Catholic in the country. Was. James says, if federal money is being used to provide legal aid to people that move about, how is that benefiting the church even materially? Surely it's the lawyers who gain. It's the NGOs who gain. Remember, the bishops, they get a cut, but it's not that much. And Dolan and the others say, oh, we don't make money. Well, you may not, but there's a lot more to this than just money. Money's a big deal to this. But when you look at the numbers, when you look at the amount of money they got and you factor in all the legal fees they had from all the McCarrick problems from 20 years ago, it begins to make sense. It's so that you put it in the context of they shut parishes down and sell them. It begins to make sense. Maureen, thank you for gifting 20 return to tradition memberships. I will see if I can figure out how to give those out unless the system does it for me. Everything has to be looked at here in context, as Marie says. Everything. 20 years ago, for the last 20 years, dioceses have been declaring bankruptcy over that issue. So they look for ways to make money, including shutting down parishes that they believe are underfunding, closing them if they have really valuable property, going after convents to shut them down when their property is highly valuable. It's all in the same context. 20 years ago, it was the McCarrick problem. And those tax records we've all been looking at for the last few days, they go back to 2009, 15 years ago. It's almost as if the government offered the Catholic Church a way out of the mess it created for itself by allowing James Martin types and McCarrick types into the priesthood and the logical consequences that fell from that. And the key lesson in that time was never picked up on by the bishops. The key lesson is stop hiding your offenders. Absolute transparency. Don't do shady things. They haven't learned their lesson. And it's unfortunate because I don't like talking about this Catholic charity stuff. I don't like painting for you a picture where it looks like literally every bishop in the United States, even the better ones, are on the wrong side of this issue. That they have sided with Mammon. That they are completely fine with subverting the stability of this country on this issue. And there's a consequence that's going to come from all this. And what is that consequence? That consequence can only ever be one thing. Anti-Catholic sentiment will be growing in this country. Guarantee it. Catholic Charities is the first one always named because they're probably the largest. But it's not just Catholic Charities. The Episcopalians are listed on those lists, the Lutherans and their equivalent organizations, non-denominational Christian groups, all of them are listed. But it's always Catholic Charities first because Catholic Charities is the biggest one. $5.2 billion since 2009, $2.9 billion in the last 4 years. When you start looking at those numbers, you see why Catholic Charities shows up on those lists first. Traditional Catholic says, which means that they're under the government's thumb. Yeah, this is what it means. And then the new boss kicked them to the curb. And this is why the bishops are foaming at the mouth and ignoring the fact that the previous American president, the super duper Catholic Joe Biden, became a stonecutter. As if the salvation of his soul doesn't matter in all this. We are the largest target. Easy pickings, absolutely. Margaret says, I've known Novus Ordo priests who are Catholics like to support trad more than they can openly do. There has been a movement in the last decade or so for the Catholic to come back in the United States, and I'm very happy to see it. Your priest should be identifiable as a priest, and he should be identifiable as a Catholic priest and not mistaken for a Protestant minister wherever he goes. although there are times where I can understand why a priest might want to be a little more incognito. I can see why that would be the case. I can understand where they're coming from, but in my mind, they should always be identifiable as a priest. And a Catholic priest in a cassock is always identifiable. I wonder what proportion of Catholic Charities employees are really Catholic. That's a good question, isn't it? Catholic Charities has the legal right to only hire Catholics. The Supreme Court has ruled on that multiple times, that religious organizations can only hire people of their faith if they so choose. And as I showed you earlier, tons of job listings in Houston, just for the Houston Diocese and the Catholic Charities there. A lot of them on this specific question. Makes you wonder why they're still hiring, by the way, if suddenly their funding is cut. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in. Please, please, please pray for everybody we spoke about today in this. The bishops, Cardinal Dolan, the vice president, anybody involved in this story, please pray for them. They do need your prayers in this time. Pray that everybody sees things clearly. And please pray also, again, as I started beginning, for the repose of the soul of Bishop Williamson, especially if you don't like him and found him offensive. Please pray for the repose of his soul. It's a good test of your charity and the command that Christ gave us to pray even for our enemies. And if you respect him the way I do, pray for the repose of his soul. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.